Yeah, so my name is Brianna McLeod. I've met some of you, but to your students, hi. I'm helping out with the food forest. I'm an intern at EOS, and you'll see me in the coming days to talk about food forest design. So with us today, we have Estelle, who runs a farm called Understory Farm and Designs, and she is the resident food forest expert. So today she's going to be quickly just introducing the topic and getting us started. Estelle?
All right, thank you very much. Hey everyone, I'm so glad to be here with you and talk to you about food forests, kind of what they are and how we design them and what it's going to look like at your schools. And I am going to talk a tiny bit about different design techniques, and it's great that Brianna is going to pick up on that with you tomorrow. So the picture that you're all looking at right now is a food forest that I helped design in Sackville, New Brunswick at the Sackville Community Garden. And what a food forest is a garden that produces food, but it uses all types of plants that what we call are perennial. So these plants come back year after year. We don't have to plant them again like we do our vegetables. They'll just keep coming back year after year and they'll grow. There'll be lots of trees and shrubs and different things. Um, and it creates a forest-like ecosystem that produces food for us. And I just want to ask all the schools to mute themselves just so that any extra sound doesn't come through. So, go. So this is another picture of that food forest in Sackville with some interns a few years back, and they're in there just doing a little maintenance of the food forest. So you can see how abundant and lush it is. And it's a forest garden that copies or mimics a natural forest. So what happens is we look at a natural forest, our forest that we just see out in the back of our schools or when we're driving down the highway, and we look at all the different things that a natural forest does and how it's designed just by nature. And we try to copy that when we plant our food gardens. And the reason that we do that is because we see that a natural forest is really resilient, which means it's really able to thrive no matter what nature throws at it most of the time. Um, and we want that in our food systems. So no matter what types of storms that we have, or big rains, or sometimes we don't have any rain and we just have so much sun, we see that these systems have ways to keep growing anyway and keep producing food anyway. And that's something that we want to do because that helps us make sure that we have lots of food. And it also helps all the plants and animals that help us have clean water, help us have lots of food from our annual gardens. And I'll talk lots more about that as we go through. And so what we want to look at is we want to imitate or copy the diversity that we see. So all the different types of plants and animals that we see in a forest, the structure that we see. So in a forest, it's not just trees, it's small trees and shrubs and small plants growing underneath and lots of animals and all the relationships that animals and plants share. And they really do have a relationship that helps them grow. So one thing that we do when we plant our forest gardens is we plant something called a guild. And what a guild means is just a whole bunch of plants and animals, like I said, working together for the same goal of survival and to thrive and to be happy and healthy. And so this is another picture of that same food forest garden in Sackville, New Brunswick. And there I am teaching people basically what I'm teaching you now. I'm just showing them all the plants and how they work together. So what we have in these systems when we're planting our food forest garden are trees and shrubs and herbs and plants that flower that are really good for pollinators. And I know at least one school is also planting a pollinator garden, so there'll be lots of good information for that. So our pollinators are not only our bees, but lots of different types of insects and sometimes even birds that help plants reproduce and move on into the future. And actually, all our food, most of our food that we eat needs pollinators to produce that food. We have something called nutrient accumulators, which are special plants that help bring up food for other plants that are deep in the soil. We have habitats, so homes for other animals and insects. And again, we have that diversity, which is all the different types of things. So we don't just want one type of thing, because what happens if you have one type of plant is if an insect or a disease comes in, it has no problem jumping from plant to plant to the next plant to the next plant. And there's no resilience, like I talked about before. There's no ability for those plants to have a break, to have anyone to help them protect themselves. But when we have a whole bunch of different types of plants, those plants are able to work together to kind of isolate that disease or that pest so that it can't just reproduce and take over the whole system and decimate everything. So that's why we want diversity. And so you can see in this picture, there's a whole bunch of different types of plants. We see a shrub there, we see tall shrubs in behind me, and we see shorter herbs in front of me. And those are the kind of things we want to think about when we're trying to design. Like, do we have all kinds of different plants growing in our forest garden? And another reason why we want to do this is because we can actually grow a lot in a small space. So that's really nice because it takes a lot of work to create the site, to build the soil, to create the garden bed. The more that we can grow in that garden bed, the better. That means more food for us and more food for the animals that we love. So here's just a picture of some of the things that have come from forest gardens. So these perennial plants, these plants that come back year after year, we don't have to plant them again. We have apples. I'm sure everybody likes eating apples. We have hazelnuts, which is a type of nut that's really delicious, walnuts, and asparagus. So these are just examples. These plants come back year after year, and they also produce food. So what we're trying to do with our diversity is create 7 layers of a food forest. This is a really big, important part of designing a food forest, is to have all types of plants that grow at different heights. And this is exactly what we see when we're looking at a natural forest. Is we have really big trees growing tall, which we call the overstory, and then we have smaller trees kind of growing underneath, and then we have shrubs under that, and then we have a whole bunch of types of plants that cover the ground, and then we have things that grow under the ground, the root layer, and then we even have vines that grow up the tree. And when we use all these 7 layers, once again, we have diversity. We have lots of different types of things, and we have lots of things growing in a small space. And they're all kind of working together. They're not competing with each other. They're all kind of working together as long as we provide enough space for each thing to grow. And I think that's another really important thing to think about when you're designing the food forest for your school is, do I have enough space for things to grow? So I wouldn't want to plant all tall trees really close together. Maybe at first when they're tiny, they'd be fine, but as soon as they start to grow and put out their branches are going to start competing with each other. There's not going to be enough sunlight and water and food. So we want to make sure we space them apart. Here's an example of that same forest garden in Sackville. This is year 2, and all the different types of plants were growing in just this little space. So we see trees, we see an apple tree back there, we see shrubs in there, we see flowers for the pollinators, we see herbs that we can use in our cooking. We even see some annual vegetables like cabbage and squash in there. We see nuts, hazelnuts, and berries, the currant bushes, all growing in the same space and all working together. So eventually, your forest gardens are going to look something like this, maybe be designed differently, but they'll look like this, and then there'll be pathways in between so that you can explore it. So it's actually a really fun place too. So I want to go quickly over all the different layers that you want to consider when you're designing your forest garden. So first is the overstory layer. So the overstory just means the really tall trees that stand over everything else in your forest garden. So for the schools, it's going to be mostly apples and pears, your fruit trees, and they're going to grow really big, really, really, really big eventually. You'll even need ladders to climb up and get all the fruit. And that's going to be your overstory layer. Those are the trees that are going to need the most space and the most room when you're trying to figure out where they're going to go in your schoolyard. And then just some other really big trees that sometimes people include are a whole bunch of different types of nut trees that produce nuts that we can eat, and they grow around here, and they also grow really, really big. And sugar maple, which is where we get maple syrup from. So sugar maple trees have a really, really sweet sap, which is taken out in the springtime and boiled down to make maple syrup, which is very delicious. So these are all examples of the overstory layer or the big tree layer. But again, for you guys, it will be mostly apples and pears that you're going to be working with. Next is your small tree layer. So these are things that don't grow quite as tall as the bigger trees, and they need a little less space in between them. Those are things like plums and cherries and serviceberry and some apples that grow smaller and mulberries. And so you can see in this picture, there's someone harvesting something. This is actually a kind of a small shrub that he's harvesting from. And you can see all the different layers. You can see a really big nut tree there in the back. You can see all kinds of shrubs. And there's all kinds of herbs growing underneath of it. So small tree layer, it's the next layer. Then we want our shrubs. Shrubs don't grow as tall as trees, and they often produce a lot of berries. And berries are really, really good for us. So it's nice to have those there. And they're good for birds as well. Birds need to eat a lot of berries. And that's how a lot of these shrubs use birds to help propagate themselves or help generate themselves again and plant themselves in different spots, because the birds eat the berries and then the seeds go through their systems and they fly away and they poop them out somewhere else. And then those seeds are able to grow somewhere else. And that way we have lots of different shrubs all over the place, and very important food for our birds. And our birds are very important to us and nice and beautiful and what we like to listen to in the morning. So shrubs again need a little bit less space. Once again, we can put them a little bit closer together. And sometimes if they're small enough, we can actually put them under our trees, especially our really big trees. And that's exactly how they grow in a forest. We'll see all kinds of different types of trees and shrubs growing underneath. Next is the herb layer. So a herb is something that grows up, produces lots of green leaves, sometimes flowers, most of the time flowers. And then when fall comes and it gets really cold, it dies right back down to the ground, but the roots stay alive underneath the ground all winter long. So right now we might look out and some of our herb layer is coming up in our natural environment right now. But as spring moves along, we're going to start seeing all these plants just start coming up all over the place. And what these are, the herb layer, the roots are still alive underground, and it just takes them a while to wake up in the spring and start growing. A lot of our herbs are what we use in cooking to make our food taste good, like sage and thyme and chives. So we'll chop them up and put them in our food. That's why we include them in our food forest. But they also really like to flower, and that's really important for our pollinators. And often we can also eat the flowers, not all the time, but sometimes we can eat the flowers. So even the flowers are edible to us, and they help pollinators as well. So our herb layer, some herbs grow really tall and some grow shorter, and we put them right under our trees, especially when our trees are really young. When we're going to plant them this spring, there's going to be a lot of sunlight coming in while those trees grow, and we can plant herbs all around them. One, to cover the soil, and two, to provide food for pollinators, and three, to provide food for us. So we want to make sure that we include lots of different herbs around each of our trees and our shrubs that we're planting. And these are just examples of different types of herbs that you can use. And there's many, many more as well. The next is the root layer. So these are things that grow underground, the roots, and some of them are edible. And without our roots, we would only be eating fruits and berries, and I think we'd get a little bit hungry. So roots are a really good way to add some starch into our food forest. So when we think of roots, potatoes are roots, Carrots are roots, beets are roots, and these are all annual or things that we have to plant year after year. We have to take the seed and we have to put it in the soil and we have to let it grow each year, and then we harvest it, and the next year we have to do it again. Those are some examples of our root foods that we like to eat. Potatoes can be made into French fries, for example. So there's also a lot of plants that come back year after year that we can put in the root layer. So we want to think about what can we plant in our food forests that is a root. And one thing that I'm going to provide to each of the schools is a special onion that comes back year after year. We don't have to plant it. We don't have to plant the seed and take care of it in our greenhouse and then plant it out and make sure that it's okay. It will just do that all by itself year after year, and we'll have little onions and green onions. And that's going to be our root layer in our food forests. And some of these root layers, root plants that are edible, come back in the wild naturally. We don't even have to plant them. So some of these things like burdock and dandelion are going to show up anyway, and they're also edible. And they also often provide important flowers for pollinators. So we can see that each plant has many, many different uses, not just one. And that's one of the ways that a food forest garden is really beneficial to us and the natural environment, is that it not only provides food for us, but it provides many benefits for nature. So that's why we're including such a diverse use of all these types of plants. Next is ground covers. So as you see in this picture, this is an example of a ground cover that I took a picture of in the forest. And if you look, you can see mostly just one type of plant. It is so good at growing that it allows nothing else to grow there. And this is something called bunchberry. It grows naturally in our forest, and it does have edible berries. And the reason why we want to plant ground covers, one is we like to make sure that our ground is really good and covered. And two, we don't want grass to grow. Grass is really, 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 really good at growing. And it's really good at stealing all the food and nutrients from the other plants that are trying to grow there. So we try to plant ground covers to keep out the grass. And this, it's edible, it's beautiful, it's covering the soil, and it's keeping out the things that we don't want to grow there. So thyme is an example of something we use in our cooking that we could plant as a ground cover that will have that function of keeping out the grass, but also provide something for us. And it also flowers, really important special flowers that are good for pollinators. So again, we see lots of different uses for just one plant. And then the final layer is the vine layer, which is plants that will crawl and climb up trees. We don't have a whole lot of vines here, but we do have some. And then I included spreaders and crawlers in that too. So things like grapes, we can grow grapes here. They're a delicious fruit, and they're a vine that needs something to crawl on. We have a type of kiwi that we can grow here called Hearty Kiwi. So normally the kiwis we find in the grocery store don't grow here. They need a really, really warm climate to grow, but there is a special little tiny kiwi that we can grow here. And then our blackberries and raspberries and strawberries and a type of pea. So we want to include at least one of those in our garden. But as you can see in this photo, this is our grape, our native grape that we grew in Sackville. It completely covers everything. So you want to make sure that wherever you plant your grape, you're going to leave it room to completely take over. We built a trellis for it, a special structure that it can grow on. But it can be so vigorous that it can actually take over a tree, and that tree can struggle to grow. So we want to make sure wherever we plant our grapes or our kiwis, we have a special spot that they can kind of take over. But as you can see, it's a really neat spot to be in. It's really neat to go underneath all these vines and be completely shaded. Nice spot to hang out when it's really hot out, and it produces food. So as you can see, if we include all of these different types of plants that do have different functions, we get something that looks like this. This used to be a lawn, and now it's a food forest. And although you can't see it in this picture, there's all kinds of little pathways that go in throughout that you can actually run and walk and play in the food forest garden and collect food at the same time. It's pretty fun. So the most important thing, and this is something that I'm going to come to each of your schools and do hopefully, is talk to you about how to prepare the soil. If we don't have good soil, if we just plant our trees right in the grass, they're really going to have a hard time. They're going to compete with that grass. The grass is going to steal up a lot of the water and a lot of the food that the trees need to grow. So we take our time and we make sure that we prepare the soil first. And we do something, this is what is happening here. These are 3 different projects that I've been working on where I'm putting lots of something that we call mulch down. Mulch is usually straw or leaves or compost or seaweed and even cardboard that we put down over the ground that kind of covers it over, prevents the grass from growing and other plants that we don't want to grow, and make sure that the soil is nice and covered and moist and good for soil life before we even start planting our trees. And I think this is a really, really important step to preparing your food forest. We spend days making sure that the soil is good and ready to go before we're even ready to plant. So this is going to be a big part of the work that you guys are going to help with. And I'm going to come and just show you how to do it. And basically, you add a layer of cardboard, a layer of compost, and a layer of mulch, straw, leaves, eelgrass, whatever you have on top, and then you plant into that. So here I am again, just that I'm doing another workshop, this time in person with a bunch of people showing them just that, how to cover the soil well so that everything's going to be nice and healthy and ready to grow and not competing with all the other things that are also trying to grow there. Here's an example of one of my garden beds that I did a few years ago. I was obviously breaking ground. It was very new, but look how much soil I put down on my bed before I even started planting. That's quite a lot. I put a whole bunch of cardboard and soil, and then I put straw that you can see in the background on top before I even planted in it. And the reason I did that is because I didn't want a whole bunch of grass to grow all among all the plants that I was trying to grow, because it's really hard to get out once your plants are in there, and trying to weed out the grass is really hard. So I just made sure that I put a lot of effort and time into preparing a good bed first. And why do we want to do this? There's special mushrooms, also known as fungi, that grow in the soil that have a really important relationship with plants. And plants actually don't just use sunlight and water and food, they actually work with the soil life to be healthy and strong. And plants and this special type of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi, it's a big word, but it's a good word. They work together, they share their starch and sugars that the plants produce with the mycorrhizal fungi, and the fungi in turn bring water and protection, actually medicine for the plant to help it grow and resist pests and resist disease. So the plants and the mushrooms actually work together to be really healthy and strong. They have what we like to call a mutually beneficial relationship. That is, they both benefit. They both have something to give and they both have something to receive. Now, if we don't take care of our soil, those mushrooms have a really, really hard time growing. They like the soil moist, they like it nice and covered, they like all the soil life. And if there isn't any of that there, if the soil is exposed and it gets really dried out or it gets too much rain, those mushrooms have a really hard time growing. And then in turn, the plants have a really hard time being healthy and strong. They really, really need those mushrooms to be healthy and strong, so that they can grow nice and tall and big and provide food for us. So that's one reason we take care of the soil. Another reason is some plants are able to take a very important food, a very important plant food called nitrogen from the air and bring it into the soil and share it with the rest of the plants. And I like to think of these special plants called nitrogen fixers, um, as a warehouse for all our grocery store food. So if we got all the food that we wanted for the year all at once, a lot of it would go bad and we wouldn't have any place to put it. And our fridge would be way too full and we wouldn't be able to close the door. So the nitrogen fixing plants are kind of like a warehouse that stores our food for us until we're ready for it. And these plants store all the nitrogen food, the really, really important food for plants, until they're ready to use it. And if those plants aren't there, what happens is sometimes this really important nutrient, nitrogen, either doesn't go in the soil, or if it is there, the plants can only use so much at once and the rest will just kind of wash away. So these plants are really important to include. And this is another reason why we take care of our soil, because they really take care of the soil and hold those nutrients in the soil. So peas and beans are examples of these types of plants. Lupins, which we like to see on our roadsides in June, are these types of plants. And there's a whole bunch of different types of plants that have this special function. And we want to make sure we include some of those in our forest garden so that they're kind of the warehouse for food for all the other plants that we want to grow. So I wanted to briefly talk to you about how different ways that you can design, and Brianna's going to talk to you more about this tomorrow. But one way that you can design, which is the normal way that we usually see design, is in an orchard linear design, so all in a line. So you can see the really big circles are trees, so that would be your apples and pears. The smaller dark green circles are shrubs, so those are all your berry bushes. And the little triangles or the little diamonds are your herbs and ground covers and roots and vines, and they go in between. And then the yellow part is the pathway. So when people have an orchard that they want to sell their food to, they want to just drive their tractor down the road and pick all the food and then drive up to the warehouse and send it away for shipping. They often plant this way, in a linear way. Everything has enough space to grow. The trees have enough space in between each other with smaller things in between. So this is one way that we could design. And so here's an example of doing a food forest in just that way. This is a restoration orchard that I helped design a few years back, and we're planting it in just that way because we did want to drive the tractor right down in between and collect all the food and put it in our box and then drive off and be able to sell it at market. Another way is what we like to call, it looks like the number 5 on a dice. So everything has enough space and it's organized, but it's not in rows. It has a little bit more diversity. The paths are a little bit more interesting. Still, everything has enough space to grow, but it's not as straight and narrow rows. It's a little more interesting to walk through. But it's still, if you wanted to more efficiently harvest some of your food, this is one way that you could design your food forest. So an example is the guild that I was showing you kind of uses this similar type of design. Here it is in the spring. And so you'd have a number of these placed next to each other. Each guild would kind of overlap with the other, just like the 5-sided die. And then the final or another way that you could design a garden is just to have it more interesting and creative, no lines, curvy pathways through. This is my favorite type of forest garden. Everything still has enough space, as you can see, but you don't have to have everything in rows. Things can just be a little more natural. That's kind of how a normal forest would look like. And so this is just another example of a way that you can start to figure out where you want your trees to go, where you want your shrubs to go, and where you want your herbs to go. Just make sure that everything has enough space. So here's an example of a more curvy design of a food forest that we are planting. And this is the food forest at my house, which also has curvy paths and things are just a little more spread out differently, not in a line at all. And it just makes a nice place to be. So just an example, the more lines way of like an orchard, 5-sided die, or more curvy paths and less organized, but still everything has enough space to grow. And then of course, once we have it planted, we have all kinds of flowers and food for bees, all kinds of berries for us. Those are currants and raspberries and blueberries. Look at all that color, it's amazing. This is some of the stuff that I harvested from my more curvy design, from my food forest and the big trees. So we have berries and nuts and big trees growing. And there's just so much that we can grow and harvest in abundance from our gardens, no matter how we design it. And we're also providing a lot for all the birds, bees, insects, and all the animals that these food forests need to thrive. So that's my presentation. I hope it was really helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Estelle.
You're welcome.
I see we're also just a little bit over time, so maybe I'll ask the classes if anybody has any questions or any more thoughts or things they'd like to discuss. Your teachers can send me an email, and then I'll send those questions off to Estelle, and we'll get them answered in the coming days while I do my presentations. Does that work for everybody? Yeah. All right, well, I'll take that as a yes. Again, thank you so much, Estelle, for doing this presentation. I hope it was a good start and a good overview of what a food forest is. And I look forward in the next coming days to continue with our designs. We're going to be planting soon, so I hope everyone's as excited as I am.
I love it. Stu, I see it. Thank you. It's beautiful. Whoa. Well, I'm here for any questions that you guys have in the future. Brianna will send them along to me, so just let me know.
Thanks so much, both of you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.